Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. Let's begin. Check-ins. So I'm horny and nervous, maybe about in between 30 to 40% for each. And it's coded in stillness as well. So welcome to the Stoa. I'm the steward of the Stoa, Peter Lindbergh. And the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And today we have Maybe Gray. I don't know how to introduce Maybe Gray, so maybe she can introduce herself in a moment. But I discovered her on Twitter, and she seems to be part of the rationalist, post-rationalist community, and she's a part of something called OnlyFans, which I basically discovered last month through Raven. So we're going to talk about that. And how it's going to go is that we're going to have a 90-minute conversation with all of us. So if you have to leave at the hour mark, feel free. And if you have a question, put it in the chat box. We'll mute you. You can ask it, and then we'll go from there. So that being said, Maybe, how you doing?
Hey, you guys. I'm doing good. I might introduce myself as something that you would call like an e-girl, someone who spends a lot of time having an online presence that's centered on being a feminine identified person and relating to people primarily from that kind of a lens, because I think it's an important lens right now. And part of being an e-girl for me is being on OnlyFans. OnlyFans is a website that got really popular in the last little while, maybe partly because of the whole pandemic situation, where men can pay a monthly subscription for access to photos, videos, chat with a girl who performs and posts adult content there. There's lots of really interesting stuff that I think we could talk about around what OnlyFans means to people right now and why it might be so popular. But I'm really excited to talk about just like our experiences of sexuality in general and how we can communicate better about them.
Great. So why'd you start OnlyFans, or why'd you start to go on it?
I had in the past done sex work online as a full-time sort of gig briefly. I used to be sort of one of those girls who is on the subreddits and would end up bringing boys from there to Patreon and having kind of a similar sort of subscription style. But I found that to do it all the time and to do it as your main source of income required a sort of relationship that was much more transactional than what I really enjoyed about providing adult content. It felt less like exhibitionism and more like work in a way that wasn't fun. And another thing I found was that venturing out so far into the open water of the internet and providing free adult content tended to attract some bad apples that would interact with me in ways that were scary, and it became not worth it to like pursue it as a full-time thing. But when OnlyFans became popular again, they sort of provided a place where I could set a permeable boundary around which kind of men were interacting with my content. It doesn't interest me anymore to really use that as my main source of income at all, but just having like the price of a latte every month to see my adult content seems to have this magical effect of weeding out those bad actors who would ruin it for all of the nice guys who just enjoyed a little bit of like supportive attention when they're expressing sexual attraction. And it's been really nice. It's been a really nice place for me to do what I naturally enjoy doing, being an exhibitionist little like model, e-girl, whatever you'd like to call it. And men like it too. It's nice to be there for them. It's nice to be a woman who is like responsive and receptive to expressions of attraction from men in a mimetic environment that's often really hostile to men regardless of their sexualities.
Yeah, we talked on Monday, when I mentioned you in the journal, or my journals that I do daily, I sort of put you in a category which you don't belong into, like this meta modern woman trying to make a buck, and then the meta
Mm.
crisis, and you pushed back and said, no, I'm doing this because I actually love it, and I was surprised, but not surprised in a way. So I'm curious if you can like unpack that desire. What do you get out of it, and what do you think your OnlyFans get out of it?
I think for me, there's a big way in which I am reclaiming my sense of sexuality through art. I was in relationships as a young girl that were rougher, and my sexuality didn't initially feel like it belongs to me. It felt like something that I like had to kind of like negotiate how much I was going to have to give away just because of the nature of the world. So to be able to come to a place where that's not the way that I relate with men anymore, and instead, I feel like my sexuality is very much in my own frame, on my own terms, and an expression of like joy and togetherness. And it's nice to feel like you can present yourself and your sexuality in an aesthetic way and not feel objectified. You can do it in a way that for you is very human, and I think it makes a difference. I think when you're doing it from a place that's not transactional, and you're doing it from a place of like expressing a part of yourself that is deeply human and deeply beautiful, I think people resonate with it in a different way. And I think the relationships that I have with my fans or clients or whatever you'd like to call them end up being much more like friendships, and much less like transactions.
It's interesting because you use the term often, the parasocial relationships, and I thought I was the only
Yeah.
person that actually knew what that term meant. But so maybe you can kind of tell us what that term means for you, and how that kind of comes about, because it seems almost counter to what you just said about actually being friends.
It's true. I think that one thing that anybody who's tried to start a project or get people interested in knows is that there's a way that you sort of have to funnel attention towards yourself. So at the broad level, you don't automatically have full, genuine social relationships with the people that you're interacting with when you're putting your presence out there online. At the first interaction level, the sort of relationships people are forming with you are parasocial. They experienced as like almost friendship for one of the people involved who are interacting with the content. But because at that point I don't get to know you on the other side of the camera or whatever at all, it's not social for me yet. It's not genuine for me. I am putting forward an online presence that might sometimes seem like it's addressing you directly, but it's actually just kind of broadcast to the world at that first interaction level. So at that point, the parasocial relationship is all that's available, but that doesn't mean that it's not offering anything valuable. I think that even just by being a presence that's out there genuinely broadcasting a general disposition to be positive around sexuality, whether it's experienced by male or female identified people, people who are vanilla, people who are kinky, just general sex positivity in a parasocial context, is already like stealing the culture back from this sort of watered down hookup, wanting to be desirable more than actually do the work kind of mentality that I think we're all stuck in. The nice thing about being able to offer something so valuable at that broadcast level, at that parasocial level, is that it is so tempting to people. We are so hungry for something a little bit spicier than just Pornhub. And I think for a lot of people, including men, it's too decontextualized to just be watching videos of girls doing erotic things. There's just not enough there to really feel like it gets that those crush feelings that often go along with our sexual feelings. We want the romance too. And so OnlyFans is responding to this need in the market for women and for men, to have a little bit more connection, even if it's still in this like flirty sexual kind of realm. And as people are drawn in, some people are drawn in really close. Some people are drawn in right into my heart, and I'm drawn in right into theirs. And what starts out as parasocial absolutely progresses into a genuine, like full social friendship. And And that's not something that I offer on OnlyFans. That's not something that I can offer in return for the price of a latte a month. That's something that's going to happen because it's like something we're both called to, or we're just going to pass each other in the night, and that's beautiful too. But that's what I'm really there for, is for the people who are going to make it from that like broadcast level thing that I have to offer all the way to like a deep collaborative shared life experience.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. What's coming to mind is sort of like my active daily journal writings, and they have a parasocial quality too, because people are reading them and like, are they talking? Is he talking about me? Is he talking about me? And there's like an uncertain intimacy going on there, but it's associated with the Stoa space. So there is like a real intimacy that's forming as well. So it's almost like a Trojan horse, a seductive Trojan horse to get people to the Stoa, and so we can become embodied together. And it seems like you're doing something similar with that parasocial relationship is sort of like a way to get them into the OnlyFans. And then that's a screening mechanism. And then via the discernment or the essence or the daemon or whatever you want to call it, then a real relationship could form from that.
Absolutely, yeah.
And do you have any sense how it could go a step deeper into like more of a communitas, like an actual community building from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's this way that sexuality is one of the things that faces the most like social stigma and personal shame. And when you set up the game as a sexual game, you set up the game as a game where being transgressive and subversive and vulnerable and raw and carnal is like automatically up for grabs. And it's amazing to me how when you allow people into a safe sexual space, so many other things feel safe that don't usually feel safe too. When you're allowed to tell people your sexual fantasies, you're allowed to tell people your real fantasies about your life. You're allowed to tell people what you really want out of your relationship with the world, not just your relationships with people of the sex that you're attracted to. And I think that that's what's really like going to have a ripple effect. It's not necessarily that I might cause like a wide chain of orgasms, although that's definitely true. That it's this creative spark that's really going to spread and catch fire.
Can you speak a little bit on COVID and how it relates to all of this and the rise of OnlyFans?
Yeah, absolutely. I think right now we especially don't have the normal options that we have for in real life social contact. And it's recreating a lot of very strange dynamics that we probably haven't experienced since we were dependent on other people. Like there's this way that dating right now for everyone, regardless of your age, is like risky and stigmatized and subversive, like it was when you were a teenager sneaking around a high school. And that that is something that we need to be able to talk about and be honest with ourselves about, and honest with ourselves about how we're holding that, if we want to make, you know, rational decisions that are responsible to our communities. And at the same time responsible to our own like humanity. It's really hard for us to all be this isolated, and it's really hard for us to go into that kind of isolation with a pre-existing stigma around longing for a connection, whether that's just sexual connection or any other kind of intimacy. So I think that I see often lots of memes that have like a sort of judgment around people who provide content on OnlyFans or pay for content on OnlyFans. And I think that it's too bad that the only way that we seem to be able to express ourselves about it is to have this sort of nervous laughter. It doesn't seem genuine to me that we really think it's so funny when we're spreading memes like this. It really displays to me a sexual insecurity of like, oh, look at those people having sexual feelings. I'm not like them. And I think it says more about us feeling uncomfortable in general with the conversation and having to like cope with that through humor and judgment. And I'd really like to see that kind of like all deconstructed.
Love it. So I have a few more questions for maybe, but if anyone has questions, or maybe just throw it in the chat box. If you want me to read it on your behalf, let me know. This will be going on YouTube, because I know we're talking about some sensitive material here, maybe for some, as you just alluded to, maybe. So as you know, what I like about you is that you're a nerd. And you take really good notes, and then you do your research. And you did your research on the Stoa. You went to like every session last week, and I saw your notes are crazy. And you seem to have adopted the steal the culture, which John Vervaeke coined, and then seduce the culture, which Raven coined. And you're purposing it towards this, this raw sexuality. So how do you think we could steal and seduce the culture with this?
I really love the steal and seduce the culture like tagline. I think that it already actually has like this kind of secret nod to the goal of diffusing tensions between genders in this culture war that we're in. I think stealing is so mercurial, it's so Mercury, it's so Hermes, it's such a masculine sort of like trickster energy, and it gets me so excited. I love it so much. And then seducing is very Venusian, it's very Aphrodite, and to have this kind of like androgynous merging of these two like different subversive sexy ways to look at like influencing our culture already like says so much about the way that we can like have a lot more fun working together across this gender divide. I think that one of the ways that we can like start out really easy is just by having integrity and having faith. I think that if we decide that I'm going to start ending the culture war personally, because that's my responsibility, and that means that I'm going to treat people with sensitivity regardless of their gender, I think that's like a beautiful position to start. And I think that that will ripple out and diffuse a lot of conflicts that are going on around you just by having that position even peripheral to people who are having more conflicts. And then I think the other thing is sort of like a reciprocal notion of like trust people to take that integrity on. I know that it's difficult. I know that we're all getting conditioned to be very adversarial, especially around gender issues, especially around sex issues. But we see that in this community, we're all looking to make a change. We're all looking to cross these mimetic bridges and shake hands and become friends, even if that's not how we're used to seeing each other. I think that we can do that and flirt a little bit while we're doing it. I think that we can make that part of the game, make it kind of a thing where we start trusting each other to be flirting from a place of integrity now. We start having faith in each other that we're all working together on building these bridges again, and that if you're getting a little bit of a sexy vibe from somebody, it's probably because they mean it in a good way.
Oh, flirting with integrity, that's fucking delicious. That sort of relates to mimetic mediation, that project. Yeah. So I'll pivot to the Q&A portion right now. But I think I had another question. Yes, we were talking about this, and when we zoomed in on Monday, we felt like philia with each other, because we kind of got what we're doing in the project. If you understand the Soul Project like very intuitively, which is impressive and amazing, and just this idea of being transparent. Like I'm a man, I'm horny all the time, but I'm still like ethical with my commitments, and my relational commitments. And you can do both at the same time. Like you said, if you do it with integrity, and it's fun to flirt. It's fun to be sexual and be sexy, and not pretend that certain things don't exist, certain energies don't exist. Like Benita Roy, she's having a session on Friday on the lust field, as she's calling it, right? Like the lust field is there. It's not pretend it's not there.
Yeah, we feel it.
Yeah. So when you were building communitas and we're finding communities like this, how do you think we could go about not being ignorant to that, and then B, shaming it?
I mean, I think one of the principles that I have found really helpful is this idea in sexual therapist kind of culture of don't yuck a yum. If somebody's enjoying something, if something feels good to somebody, it's okay if you don't think that would suit you. But it's nice to have a group norm where when somebody expresses enthusiasm, whether it's around something sexual or something that lights them up intellectually or anything like that, it's nice to be like, yes, and both, and this is the same coin. Let's just like make it an improv space where offers are celebrated just for being made, because that's so exciting that there's an offer on the table. It doesn't mean that you have to accept them all. You can just be aware of them all and acknowledge them all and love them all for coming into the space.
Beautiful. All right, so we're gonna go to the questions. I might not ask it in order. We might miss a few questions, but we'll start with Hannah. You had something about the pushback on OnlyFans.
Hi. So I heard that there is pushback from the OnlyFans website against hosting adult content there, and I'm wondering if this is a big concern for you and other people doing things like what you're doing.
I can't speak to how sex workers who do this for a living would feel. I'm not relying on this for an income, so I am not going to experience any sort of like financial insecurity if OnlyFans decides to like give me the boot. So I want to be sensitive to that and just mention that I'm not at all speaking to it on a financial level. But apart from that, it doesn't concern me. It doesn't surprise me. This is something that's just tried and true. Lots and lots of social media platforms get very, very far on adult content, which once they get that far, promptly remove from their website. And it's just one of those fun ways that people like exploit sex workers. That happens. I guess at this point, it's just, I'm used to it. I'm bored of it. I'm adaptable. I'm resilient. I'm anti-fragile. I started on Twitter having a thirst trap thread, and my big innovation was just to actually thread it so that they're always there, so that you can always find them. Because I don't need to be like, I don't know, coy about the fact that I'm somebody who posts adult content. If OnlyFans doesn't work, Twitter will keep working for me. Other places will keep working for me. I am naked under my clothes all of the time. There is a camera in my cell phone. And there are just way too many places on the internet to post content. I will always find a way to share those things that I love to share.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cool. Camille, you had a question about practices.
Hi. What life practices create raw sexuality, and what are some of yours?
I love this question. I think it's a brilliant question. My Bible, when it comes to this question, is a book called Mating in Captivity by Esther Perel. It is written for people in monogamous relationships, but I think that it absolutely applies to both monogamous and non-monogamous relationships, and it's very useful to read, even if you're not dating anybody at the moment. It talks about the fact that the more security and intimacy you seek in a relationship, the more freedom and eroticism you're going to have to forfeit in order to maintain that level of closeness. An analogy I like to use to explain it is that lust really is like a fire. If you smother it, it goes out. You need oxygen for that fire to burn. So life practices that work for me to keep sexual sparks nice and frequent and spicy in my relationships, whether they're monogamous or non-monogamous at any given time, is stuff like having your own projects. Just having stuff that's going on in your life that does not have to do with your partner is a huge way to make sure that there's always this like independence and mystery that you two have for yourselves, and have as like this thing to like flirt around with and like tease around in front of each other. It's very exciting to my boyfriend that I'm on a Zoom call right now doing my own thing and being, a big independent personality. I think that that's something that he finds really attractive. And the fact that he's probably over in another room making his own music is like very attractive to me. The fact that we can give each other that space to have our own interests is super, super important. I think the other big thing, other than having your own life, is sharing it like fully. Be totally honest. There is like so many there's so many regrets and like bad arguments that I've had in my relationships because I like had a 5-second opportunity to fess up to something and I got insecure and I didn't quite take the opportunity, and then everything snowballs. there's these like moments of integrity that come to you, and they feel karmically loaded, and you have to be ready to like stop and really practice your stoicism in those moments and be willing to like fully share exactly what's going on for you, even if you've been conditioned to think that it's not acceptable. It's the faith leap that you make on a daily basis to like know that your partner loves you beyond the limitations that society suggests for them.
Cool. Rhea, you had a question?
I do. Thanks, Peter, and thanks, Maybe, for being here.
Thank
Question was, or is, how has creating erotic art and being on camera in this manner allowed you to connect more deeply with yourself? And do you feel that this practice, whether it is shared or just for personal use, is valuable for more people to experience when it comes to connecting to sacred sexuality within themselves?
Yeah, I love this question. I absolutely think that there is a lot of joy and self-connection to be found with experimenting with creating art, whether it's of yourself or any other form of art. I think in particular, though, there's a lot of barriers to celebrating the way that you feel about your body. I think that there's a lot of realms where we are invited to talk about how oppressed we feel by beauty ideals and how difficult it is for us. And I think that that's important. I think that those are feelings that need to be put out there. But I don't often see a more constructive space that I think naturally follows from that deconstructive understanding of how beauty ideals don't help us. If beauty ideals don't help us, we need to reclaim what we're allowed to think is aesthetic and make offers to the meme space about what we think the aesthetic boundaries should and shouldn't be. And I think that when we say something like, I think my body looks really good in this piece of art, we're inviting people to have those kinds of thoughts about themselves too. And I think that that is part of seducing the culture and like bringing people a reason to feel on a felt sense that they should be body positive and sex positive, rather than doing a sermon or preaching to them that they have the wrong idea about their bodies. I think I hear from you too that there's like something about divinity. I think I was at the gender and transition and discourse talk yesterday, and something that came up was this idea that we've talked a lot recently in culture about masculinity and femininity as scientific concepts, but they have been spiritual concepts just as long as we've connected them to biology. I think that there's this way that different cultures across time and different religions have presented masculinity and femininity in these like patterned ways, and there's ways that sometimes they reverse themselves, but they always kind of present a polarity, and that polarity I think says something about what it's like to be a human being, regardless of which gender identity you present more forwardly with. And I think that when you step into a space where you're making art around your body in a way that's likely going to be received as gendered, there's an opportunity to rub up against all of these different interconnections between mimetic spaces that focus on science and spirituality and relationships and money. I think all of those are really interesting spaces that sex interconnects with. And I think that it's good for us to experiment with spaces that allow us to look at it from multiple perspectives.
Great. Tyson, you had a question or statement?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thank you, Maybe. I found myself feeling a little nervous to bring this up. And so I'll express a perspective that I'm definitely not attached to, but it definitely comes up for me. And that is, I can imagine myself being single and not in a relationship. And in that case, longing for connection and sexual connection, especially, and going to things like OnlyFans, subscribing to content, and then starting to get that crush feeling and connection through there. And when I imagine myself in that scenario, it concerns me that this would happen and that this is happening with other men, that would enable like some of my poorest behaviors, like not working on my physicality and my body and my vocation and other things because I can just escape here. And so and then it makes me skeptical that a lot of women would want to be with a man that is subscribed to content, say on OnlyFans, because of some of the behavior that might enable. So I'm curious what you think about that.
I think this is a really important like intuition that you're teasing out. And I think that it has to do with something that like impacts us throughout our sexual lives, whether we are more feminine or more masculine presenting. I think that we often talk about sexual practices and not sexual ways of being. And that's where we end up having these like dichotomous relationships with things like masturbating or using porn. There's this way that it can go really, really well or really, really poorly. And that makes us confused about which sort of practices we should choose because we're not aware that the problem is actually like a where your heart's at thing, not a what you're doing thing. So there's this way that I think that it's almost a little bit like recreational drug use or alcohol drinking. I think that there's absolutely dangers to using pornographic aids in your sex life. And it's something that you should have like an open, honest relationship with yourself about. And if you have some sort of way in which you're relating to pornographic material that isn't healthy for you, that's okay. That's a normal, totally not unique place to start at in your sexual journey. There's no reason to like demonize yourself or think you did a bad thing or you made a big mistake or anything like that. You just want to like look at your sex life and think, what would get me off even more than this? Would I get off even harder on having better relationships and like treating myself better? Would that be even sexier? Because I think for most of us, it would. I think for most of us, we have a lot of room to treat ourselves in ways that make us feel sexier about all sorts of areas of our life. I do want to speak also, though, to the idea that that's something that I do think about. Like, I am making adult content and I'm putting it out there in a place where men are vulnerable and men don't necessarily have the resources to be using my content in a way that's healthy for them. And that does concern me. I really care about that. And my heart really goes out to men who are having these sort of struggles and then finding that I am like a crutch, something that keeps them coping and not thriving. That breaks my heart. The thing that keeps me there, that keeps me taking that risk of being an enabler is that I also know that the very most vulnerable men who very most need my help are probably not getting really any interactions with women except in these contexts. And I'm willing to go to the darkest places to find the people who need the most light brought into their life. I pray that I don't hurt more than I help. But I'm absolutely aware that I have like a higher ignorance around it. I'm just doing my best, and I have my heart in the right place. And for that, that's my way of being issue. I have my heart in the right place. I've chosen a practice that I hope is in alignment, but I will always be open to feedback, and I will always be open to realigning so that I'm doing like the most good in the world that I can do.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful, and I really felt that. And I have a follow-up question. It's about masturbation and the no-fap movement. And I mentioned this in my journal that my stance is that most men should stop masturbating and on all ontological domains. That's how I worded it. And you and I were talking last time, like I haven't masturbated like 5+ years, and it feels fucking great. I have no desire to do it whatsoever. There's a lot of benefits that come from that. And then the whole no-fap movement supports that as well. And then you were like, I thought, oh, you would push back to it, but you don't have that sort of shame, projected shame on it. And we were talking about how, yes, each person's spiritual practice might be radically different given their kind of trajectory, their past trauma, all that type of stuff. And it seems like you have a sensitivity about people getting stuck into like the more pathological forms of self-pleasure. So what do you think about the whole no-fap movement in general?
I guess, okay, I'm gonna do a compliment sandwich. I like to give feedback that might be a little bit more constructive. Like, bracketed with a lot of positive energy. So the first thing I want to say is that people who are considering nofap are looking at their sex lives and seeing that they can make changes that make it a way that would be more exciting and make their life better. And I'm so excited. I'm just so excited that people would have ideas about how to do different things with their sexual relationships with themselves. Just that alone is fantastic. I think that especially the idea that that you can want something and see that it's possible, and those are the only two ingredients to making a different life for yourself. It is like something that I think is available to people from the nofap movement that might not be available to them otherwise. And I think it's like foundational. I think if that's the first place that you go and you find out that you can change who you are all by yourself, that will ripple throughout your whole life. It'll be more than just a sexual opportunity for you. That being said, I think sometimes, like so many exciting, like intellectual and spiritual insights that we get, we can like have them experience this big moment of clarity and spaciousness, and then immediately start striving so hard. And that takes us into a different way of being. We're not open and spacious and excited about a spiritual insight anymore. We're striving and trying to be good enough and tracking and monitoring and collecting statistics. And it starts to be a little bit more on the left brain side and a little bit less on the right brain, reconnect to my body, change my relationship with myself, have a more sexually positive experience of my world kind of way of being. So when you can like keep an eye out for that pitfall, you can totally experiment with this idea of like, oh, maybe sexual energy can be used in other ways that I actually find more fulfilling. And that really excites me. I'm going to make some small bets and see how big they pay off around that. That I think is super exciting. I think it's just important to make sure that when you pick up something like nofap, it doesn't become another stick to beat yourself with around your sexuality. It shouldn't be something that you should see as like this opportunity to fail and feel bad about yourself. You should see it as an opportunity to fail and learn about yourself and try again and try new things. That's awesome.
Very cool. And so maybe and I were talking about her having a series here at the STOA, maybe call it Raw Sexuality with maybe Gray or something, and you just make like a question, like you bring people in to talk to. And I would love for you to interact with someone in the nofap community and have this discussion, because I think you're uniquely placed to have it in such a good faith way.
Yeah.
So Travis, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. So I just noticed that what comes up with me is like a knee-jerk reaction that things like OnlyFans or any sort of like, I guess pornography is largely driven by like hedonism, or an idea that like sensual pleasure is something that should be pursued, revered, sometimes idolized. And I recognize that that's probably just the dominant social narrative that's kind of been implanted. And so I wanted to hear, because I hear tones of hedonism sometimes, and then I hear other philosophies. And so I'm curious from your perspective what the various philosophies underlying sex work are, and what your perspective is on the criticisms of idolizing and like pursuing sensual pleasure. First one that comes up for me is like Buddhism's idea, or like early Buddhism's idea, that sensual pleasure is like a trap that gets us trapped in craving and that leads to our suffering. So any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, actually, I like that you bring up Buddhism, because I think Buddhism is like a very fertile area to look at like different sexual perspectives. I think that, yeah, absolutely, Buddhism has this surface level reading of asceticism, renunciance, saying that there are all of these like bells and whistles, all of these fancy toys in the world that I could use to amuse myself, but that would distract me from curing the sickness of suffering. And I am very sympathetic to that like mainstream Buddhist take on making sure that you're skeptical about your relationship with sexual pleasure, making sure that you have like a healthy sense of questioning and curiosity around whether or not pursuing sexual pleasure ultimately actually offers you something that isn't like just fleeting and meaningless. I think that that's something that it asks about everything, which is important. I think that it's interesting that also within Buddhism, though, there are tantric perspectives which say that precisely because sensual pleasures are so tempting, are so distracting, are so dangerous, they also have an enormous spiritual power available to them if we're willing to look at them as tools from a more spiritual way of being. It reminds me actually very much of the use of entheogens in spiritual practice compared to recreational practice. I think that we have maybe like a picture from media of like what a guy on LSD is like, and usually at some point in the scene he talks about jumping out a window and a bunch of less tripping people have to convince him that he can't fly or something like that. And that is a way that some people act on entheogens, but usually there's like more emphasis in spiritual communities on the use of those kinds of substances to achieve some sort of like self-discovery, some sort of connection to something beyond yourself, beyond even humanity. And I think that there is like a profoundly numinous aspect to sensual pleasure in general, but sexual pleasure especially. And we should be as curious about the power that we could, harness for our spiritual development that is presented by sensual desire, as we should be about the hazards of sensual pleasure in terms of our spiritual development.
Cool. Ali, you had a question. You still want to ask it?
Maybe somewhat touched upon this briefly when you touched upon this briefly when you talked about the following phase you have and how you care about their emotional states. And this is building up on last Friday's session with Bonita, where we discussed somewhat extensively the 7 basic systems of emotions, and the liking system sometimes used synonymously with the lust system.
Mm-hmm.
And a deprivation from this system we know results in depression. I just wanted to know what's your experience with this liking system or being separated from your experience with your online following, which I didn't know existed until today. I mean, we've been on a few sessions for the past few weeks, but yeah.
So could you rephrase your question? Sorry, you're wondering what I think about this kind of separation between me and my fan base and whether or not that
Yes.
contributes to their depression or something?
Exactly, yeah.
Right. I think that this speaks a lot to an atomization that is like just a crisis across different kind of social realms right now. I think that it is really difficult to find alternatives. I mean, especially right now with all of the pandemic measures and stuff like that. But even before, so much of our sexual interactions have become mediated by apps of various kinds, and I do think that it's something that I would like to see become a gateway to better real life sexual intimacy and not the substitute for real life sexual intimacy. I think that that's something that we do really need to build a community around, though. I don't think any one of us can change the dating culture by ourselves and move it offline again. I think that it's going to take a lot of us all being very clever about how we can build bridges from offline or online to offline communities, and how to really show up and be vulnerable in those in real life spaces so that they are seductive and transformative for people, and they become like forceful, they gain momentum and are able to sustain themselves the way that our online communities are able to like keep feeding energy into themselves and continuing forward into the future.
Cool. Anjan, do you want to take onto that? And you had a question about porn and hijacking
Hey, maybe. My
Hi.
question is, there's an evolutionary biologist named Bob Trivers. And it's kind of jargony, but it always resonated with me. He had this thing where he called Netflix, even sugar, and porn phenotypic hijacking. It's something that's taking advantage of our inbuilt propensities. I'm curious, what's your reaction to that? And maybe as a follow-up, do you think Trivers is maybe underestimating today's society, how it's lacking a lot of things that maybe we were used to in more matched environments in past evolution?
Right. I think that there is this way that the sort of sexual content that's available right now can be compared to junk food or figs. Like they're very, very packed with a whole bunch of calories and sugar that usually you're supposed to be able to like save up and use and get by for a long time on, instead of just binging on and binging on and binging on. I think that you're right, though, to note that if we just focus on how hyper stimulating the things that tempt us are, we're not maybe paying enough attention to why we might need these like unbelievably powerful sources of stimulation. Maybe it's because we're starving. Maybe it's because in some very real way, we do need that much nourishment because we feel very malnourished in our sexual lives. I think that we need to like look very far back in history and read the story of our sexual relationship with each other as a species, and understand that it's been like a slow crawl out of a dark place, and it's not easy for us to relate to each other on this level. We've been making it up as we go along and learning and getting to know each other this whole time. And I think that the culture war really does a very good job of hiding from us how hard we have been trying and how much we have been doing our best and working together for generations to prove communications between the binary genders that are imposed upon us. I don't know if that answers your question.
If I could also ask, there's something that came up while you were saying that. Have you read Brave New World, and what's your reaction to that being the end stage of a lot of this stuff?
I haven't read Brave New World, but I think just from it being in the meme space, I understand that it's not a happy story. It's pretty pessimistic. Is that right?
Yeah, it takes our utopia and shows us how not happy that may be.
I'm a fan of pessimism. I'm more familiar with Schopenhauer and his ethics of compassion. Schopenhauer.
The specific point about Brave New World was kind of, I guess it was written at a time where it must have been crazy. It's less crazy today, but it's just like everybody's super sexually liberated, and they have like orgy parties where they're just, things like that. And the idea was, like, at that time when Huxley wrote it, this was considered like everybody wanted this. So, people were so sexually conservative.
It is interesting. I think that there have been like weird waves of sexual conservatism and sexual liberalism, but they've all kind of required a lot more synthesis. There's this way that I can see how we match up to like past fears about what the sexual landscape could turn into. But I can also see ways in which those like pejorative paintings of the culture that we live in now are just like glossing over all of the escape routes we have from this kind of culture. I think that there's lots of opportunities to break out of like the narrow idea of the hypersexualized modernity. We just have to be willing to be more creative than Aldous Huxley.
Cool. I'm going to circle back to Rain's question. Rain, do you still want to ask it?
Sure. Hi, thanks for being on here. My question, well, I have two questions. The first one is kind of vague intentionally, but just curious your thoughts about non-binary and queer sex work. Like, what's the status of that? What do you see online around that? And then my second question is kind of in the realm of like heteronormativity, of like, is the buying power of straight men influencing the way that sex work is framed and understood and how the platforms are designed. And I mean that as a very open question, more than an accusation. And yeah, curious to hear your thoughts.
Awesome. To the first point, I find that gender non-conforming sex work is not super visible to me. I think it has a lot to do with the way that the culture war is set up right now. There's a lot of sensationalism around men and women, and the only kind of discussions that we have in the meme space going on around gender non-conforming people are frankly not sexy. They have to do a lot with like making sure you have your pronouns or making sure that you know your labels, and they're very confusing for straight people. They're very confusing for questioning people. Frankly, it sounds like they're quite confusing for gender non-conforming people themselves. I think that the picture that people get of like non-conforming sex work is too squishy and confusing and like trapped in the collateral damage field of the culture war zone. So it doesn't get like the spotlight it deserves. And I think that's so sad, because I think gender non-conforming artists are so hot and they're doing such interesting things with their work. And the couple that I know personally, so that I do get like exposed to their artwork, blow me away and influence me a lot. And so I think it's too bad that this platform isn't doing for them what it's doing for people like me, because it totally could if we changed the mimetic landscape. To your second point, it's interesting. I absolutely see this like heterosexism in sex work, whether it's Pornhub or OnlyFans or anywhere else. And to link back to your other question, I do think, again, it has a lot to do with the way that culture wars sensationalizes gender as a binary or maybe not, like question mark, question mark, question mark. And so I think that it encourages men in particular to almost like spite consume women's content a lot of the time. And it also, I think, inspires women to spite produce adult content, because we're in this like adversarial, transactional, competitive sort of atmosphere within and between genders a lot of the time. I don't know if I would call that like something that's spurred on by the buying power of heterosexual men. I think it has more to do with the parameters of the sex work industry and how they are influenced by social and sexual limitations that are imposed on all of us. I think that there could be a lot more interesting porn that is a lot more like raw and evocative to basically everybody. But there's just kind of a tiling structure. There's this acceptable kind of adult content that it was already out there and it has a lot of momentum behind it, and it keeps getting made over and over and over again. The wheel gets reinvented and men keep buying it, and it keeps being unsexy to people outside of that little cishet male sphere. And I think it's just like, yeah, it's just a Moloch problem. Porn could be way better for everybody, but it's not, because of the regular practical misincentives.
Cool. Rain, do you have any follow-up to that?
No, that was great. Thank you.
Key, you have a question.
Hi, Maybe Great.
Hey.
Thank you for a lot of what you spoke about today. I think that it is really important to tap into what is good within our sexualities and unleash that in the ways that you've described. So, and yeah, I've learned a lot. But my question is, what principles do you use to be aware of or combat exploitation on either side? So the sex worker versus the consumer.
I think that's a really interesting question. And I think it's one that's going to be difficult for me to answer, because the norms and the boundaries that I've developed around producing adult content have evolved and emerged really naturally over time. One thing that I think has helped me on my journey as being an adult content creator is having an attitude of starting slow and expanding with my comfort level. I think that a lot of women are maybe offered opportunities to make content that's more explicit than they're initially ready to make. And they maybe feel like they need to take that opportunity before really sitting with themselves and deciding what's fun for them and where the boundaries of exhibitionism for them are. I was lucky to find really good mentors early on in the adult content community who helped me make good decisions about going slow and respecting myself in the sex work field. But I think there definitely need to be more figures out there like that for women like me who are just getting started, to encourage people to take it at their own pace and make sure they're checking in with their bodies physically to see what's arousing to them, because this doesn't have to be transactional for women or other genders that decide to make adult content. It's something that can feel fun and sexy for you. And if it feels fun and sexy for you, it will be premium content, because a lot of the time people are doing this out of a place of needing the money or needing the validation even. And to come from this like self-assured place about it will be really helpful for you.
Well, so it's interesting that you say when you feel fun and sexy, it's premium content. Only because I'd like to focus on the consumer side of exploitation, kind of circling back to Tyson's question earlier. Like, I think it's great that there are mentors in the space that can help women who think that they would like to go into the space for their own personal reasons. But I wonder, like you said, because it's evolved over time for you, the lessons that you've learned from the consumer side.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the advice inverts very well. I think that for men, very much, and anybody on the consumer side of sex workers content, starting slow and maintaining a self-connection and a respect for yourself are still the principles that I would use to guide that kind of behavior. I think that if you're honest with yourself about your desires and you're honest with yourself about the ways in which masturbatory aids meet them for you, I think that shame and pressure fall away very naturally in that transparent relationship with yourself.
I think that's great, and that's like a type of education that's required to avoid other questions coming up about, you know, the depression aspects or the sort of COVID situation that people are in right now. So yeah, thank you.
Cool. So administrative note, we're at the hour mark. I think we'll continue maybe 15, 30 minutes. We'll end somewhere with discernment. I'll throw a link on the chat box too, in case you want to continue this discussion in a different room. But we'll go for a little bit more. Hannah, you had an interesting follow-up question.
Where did it go? Okay. So there was an early question. I didn't scroll up to see who typed it, but it was something like, is it unattractive in the IRL dating world to be a purveyor of sex work, especially online adult content? And Peter and I had kind of discussed how there's judgment and shame from the dominant culture around that. And it's my personal hope that that's decreasing, but I don't know. And I'm wondering if you have any insights on that.
I mean, I can only speak as one person for the most part. I don't have my thumb on the pulse of like how people are treating each other in their circles of friends around finding these kinds of things out. I don't know what it looks like on Tinder when these kinds of conversations go on. I just know about my relationships with my clients and my personal relationships with people I meet on Twitter and in real life and stuff like that. But to me, I don't have some sort of pejorative understanding of people who masturbate and use porn or have alternative sexual desires. Maybe I'm a uniquely open-minded person, But even if I am, I think the fact that I can be this open about being that open-minded means that at least some of the things in our mimetic sphere are changing for the better. I really hope that people can learn to be more accepting and excited about people who are passionate about adult content. I think that there isn't really any way to judge somebody's sex life without expressing your own sexual insecurity. I think that when we are genuinely assured in our own sexual practices and sexual beings, and someone else lives out a sexual practice or sexual way of being that doesn't appeal to us, we don't actually get very much of a disgust response or an urge to judge. I think that when we're feeling really secure in ourselves and other people do things that aren't interesting to us, we are excited for them to be exploring their interests and excited to explore other interests ourselves. I think that we have to be really skeptical of our urge to look at anybody's sexual practices and assume that they are unhealthy or that they shouldn't be enjoyable for anybody.
Great. Tom, you had a question.
Yes. So I really have to go in like 5 minutes, so I won't have time to hear the answer, but I will listen to it on YouTube if it's in the video. This was building up a little bit on Hannah's comment on the comparison with Twitch. And it really struck me is that this kind of comparison really struck me, and I saw this. So what she said is that you can have this kind of Trojan horses, which basically you get inside a Trojan horse. And what I wanted to ask is basically you have these two sides where you can use those Trojan horse to for good, for example, or for bad, as Tyson said. And from your point of view, do you see the difference basically? And what can you do to influence those consumers on which side they will fall? Basically, will they just be addictive and lose their time? And will they get kind of hacked into this nefarious situation? Or can you improve the situation?
I think this is an awesome question. I hope that you get to hear at least some of it, but I'm glad that you'll tune in later if you can. Well, I do think that it's something that I have this meta awareness about, that this could be used as easily for good as for evil. And I think that having strong boundaries around the quality and amount of attention that I give is like the main kind of diagnostic tool that I use. I find that if somebody is engaging with my content on a level that seems superficial or copy or even just ordinary, even if it's just, yeah, they're here to, you know, assist themselves in their masturbatory journey and then leave, then that's fine. But I don't actually spend a bunch of like quality time and attention interacting with people who are only interacting with my content on that level. I don't have any judgment for it. And I'm not responsible for making sure that that's like being used in moderation for people who are using it that way. I leave that responsibility where it belongs, with the consumer. But at the same time, that I guess in like a regular social context, there's something that we think of as leading people on. I don't do that. If somebody is looking for a masturbatory aid, that is what I provide them. I don't give them some sort of illusion that I'm secretly trying to offer them something more. I offer more when I see a need for more that I know that I can meet on a soul level. If somebody is interacting with my content and then they're voicing things to me about like the vulnerabilities that they feel or the fantasies that they have that they don't feel like they can share in real life, that's somebody that I may be like, take a little bit of a double click with. And I want to see more about that vulnerability. And I want to see more about those unmet needs for sexual expression and see if there's a way that I can offer an outlet that aligns with the work that I'm doing in my life anyway. Sometimes there's like, you know, the 1% of times where I just absolutely click with somebody and they enter the space as an adult content consumer and now they are my very best friend. and that's super exciting too. And then they get a whole bunch of quality time and attention from me, and that can look a whole bunch of different ways depending on the kind of connection that we have. But there really is that really wide spectrum, and the main way that I keep myself safe and keep other people safe is by having the appropriate quality and amount of attention like distributed at different levels of this sort of like intimacy level of the interaction.
Cool. Walter, I think you had a question that we missed at near the beginning.
Oh, hey. Thank you for taking my question. You actually spoke very well to a bunch of these points, but it's something that I think might keep coming up. So a lot of the different internet groups that would have led a lot of people to a group like this one, the STOA, we used to spend a lot of time arguing about religion, and fortunately those arguments have kind of toned down a little bit and they've become more interesting in my own opinion. And then it looks like the next thing that could really divide people would be sexuality, for example. When people host these sorts of events, it's sort of like the moderator almost has to eventually take a stand on whether we're kind of a pro-monogamy sort of a community or a pro-polyamory sort of a community or a pro-porn or an anti-porn, because those things are going to keep coming up. I think it's possible that it could come to a place where it's more like a live and let live, and that there's some sort of a balanced understanding that people come to different worldviews. But I don't know, do you have any sense of how long that might take, or if it's just going to completely split a bunch of these groups? Because a lot of people come to these groups with a strong anti-authoritarian bent, but also a curiosity about the benefits of older traditions.
I absolutely relate to that. I think that that's something that I see as like a commonality that goes through a lot of people in the, meta-rational community. This like idea of like, oh, there's something really important about traditions, but we could be totally different. Oh yeah, absolutely. And I love that. I love that we feel so strongly in both of these like seemingly tense directions. I think that the opinion I have on this issue is an opinion I have on a lot of like divisive political and mimetic issues, which is that the problem is that we approach the discourse with this identitarian lens. People have lots of really strong feelings about monogamy and polyamory because those are presented to them as categories of people that they can choose to be. And if they were presented to them as what they are, which is tools like along a spectrum that can help you shape your relationship structures in ways that, maximize the freedom and enjoyment for everybody involved in them, I think that they would be a lot less divisive. That wouldn't suit the culture war at all. So the culture war isn't going to help us out on that. We're going to have to be the resistance to the culture war and bring in this kind of lens mentality to replace the identitarian mentality. And then I think it's amazing how quickly the tensions dissolve when you're not being asked to pick a tribe. As soon as you're not like choosing a team, you can just be like, oh yeah, I can see how both of these would be good for different people in different situations. Like, I don't know why people fight about it.
Cool. So this will probably be our last comment. Mac, I know you had something burning. I don't know if you asked it in the chat room, but you can unmute yourself and ask it now.
Yeah. So I was inspired by your question, Peter, of NoFap, of this concept of NoFap, and maybe gave an amazing response to that. And I wanted to actually draw a contrast by proposing a fun little hypothetical of what about a concept like AllFap? We're talking about masturbating 20 times a day. We're talking about very, very weak orgasms. We're talking about a serious interest in pornography and as a consumer. And I was hoping maybe it'd be interesting to see what you say, just flipping that concept of what your reaction to that would be.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the point for me of like the idea of mainstream Buddhism compared to tantric Buddhism. I think that you can commit yourself to being celibate And that is such a strong position to take, and it's such a commitment, and it takes so much investment, and it's really like an act of devotion, whether it's to yourself or to a higher power or just to the life that you want to live. And I think that you can absolutely like find that same way of being and pendulum swing it all the way to the other side and be like, no, I want to understand myself as a sexual being so deeply that I am willing to make like my month about investigating what turns me on and what turns me off, what that's like in my body, what that says about the nature of reality, and how it's like unconsciously influencing the way that I interact in seemingly non-sexual contexts. I think that there is like such a rich spiritual mystery that we can like put our detectives hats on and go out and exploring if we decide that sexual pleasure is as numinous and interesting as sexual restraint.
Do you have any follow-up questions to that, Mac?
Oh no, I was just really enjoying the response. I think your perspective is exactly what is needed. And I didn't know what we were going to get into talking about sex work here at the Stoa, and I mean, yeah, it's exactly what we need, to be honest. Yeah, and I've actually had a much more healthy relationship with porn lately, and not mind moderating my use, but actually I'm really looking at how phallus is expressed and how the female form is expressed and how those two interact. And then it is absolutely fascinating if you take it seriously and not just a masturbatory aid or whatever. And that's what I hear in your voice. And it's coming from like such an authentic place, and I love it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, amen to that. And Mac is like a crazy ass artist here in Toronto, so I'm trying to do some homosocial seduction to get him at the Stoa. So stay tuned for some Mac time. So yeah, you have time for one more question, maybe? Sarah dropped a really good one in the chat. Sarah, could you unmute yourself and ask it?
Yeah, I was following on to, Hannah had asked a question about therapy, and I wanted to ask, do you feel a potential sense of kinship with the role of temple prostitute? Like, temple prostitute was or is a role that fit with like traditional ways of connecting with religious practice through physical intimacy. And then the therapist role is like a modernist practice of like structured emotional intimacy. And is there a kind of like meta-modern tantric philosopher role emerging?
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, this definitely hits on like a passion of mine. I have a religious studies kind of background, and so I particularly like East Asian Buddhism, and they have this concept of the Miko, who is a sort of like spiritual medium and sexual temptation at the same time in Buddhist spheres. And I find that very very poetic. I think that we have a very long conversation that's been going on about patriarchy and what it means and what to do about it. And sometimes I like to think about what maybe the good aspects of having a power dynamic are, not so that we can keep it in place, but so that we can appreciate what we have been gaining from it spiritually as it's been playing out. And I think that the Miko is providing a perspective that is practical, physical, but also poetic and paranormal. There's something absolutely magic about it. And I think that it also reminds me very much of the paintings of the 9 stages of decay. I wrote a paper on these East Asian Buddhist paintings that portray the corpse of a woman in 9 stages as she decays and is, reduced to a skeleton, and then maybe there's a grave marker at the end, if anything. And there's this beautiful beautiful notion, I think, that is conveyed by the use of a woman's corpse in particular, because women have unbounded bodies. They menstruate. They have this relationship that is less bounded and more diffuse in the material world. And that goes counter to the mainstream Buddhist values of being closed and contained and complete in a way. And there's this way that we can subvert these purity and impurity dynamics and use what is seen as an inherent relationship with impurity because of the structure of a certain kind of body, and show how that can be a mentor to people who have idealized bodies, and how there's like an educational relationship between being idealized and being demonized, and that by putting each other in these roles, we have actually been playing a grand sort of spiritual experiment that we'll have to understand before we can start playing a new one.
Wow. Okay. Some good stuff there. Let's end it here. I'll make some closing announcements, but maybe do you have any kind of closing thoughts for us?
Only that I'm absolutely happy if anybody feels like there's something really burning for them and they want to keep talking. If somebody throws a link for another Zoom room, I would absolutely join and continue this conversation. I know that some of this stuff can be raw, and I don't want to leave anybody in this conversation until everybody's grounded and ready to move on with their day. So
Great.
just know that I'm absolutely available.
Beautiful. And so I dropped, I think I'm just going to use the Game B coffee house for our after party room. So just go to gameb.coffee. I'll debrief with maybe for a couple minutes, but then she'll join that chat room afterwards. So that being said, that's awesome. First introduction at the Stoa. That was really, really great. So thank you so much, Maybe, for coming here today to Stoa. And thanks for everyone for asking excellent questions as well. Announcements on upcoming events. If you go to thestoa.ca, we got Daniel Schmachtenberger coming in, and we have over like 100 people RSVP'd for that one. Converting Moloch from Sith to Jedi at 7 p.m. Eastern time. Live players with Samuel Burgess tomorrow at 8 p.m. Eastern time. That's going to be a regular reoccurring series at the Stoa as well. We have a few other ones, including Daniel Thornson's Welcome Back Party on Monday, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. A lot of fucking cool events coming. So just check out the Stoa. Sign up to the mailing list, and it's based off a gift economy. If you're inspired to provide a gift to the Stoa, you can just look up the information there. Anything else? No, I think that's it. Thank you, everyone.